Hi everyone, it's Knife22 here. I hope you guys are all well, and welcome to the next opening in the series. Today we will be covering the Ruy Lopez opening, or the Spanish opening. So I hope you guys enjoyed. It is a very useful opening. So today we're just going to see some of the main lines you may come across in the Ruy Lopez and how to play it really well. So this is how it looks at the start. I will just recap for some of you. If you play your pawn out to e4, and if your opponent doesn't go for the Sicilian, which is the most common move, the second most common move is pawn out to e5. Pretty standard stuff. And if you play knight out to f3, you don't fancy going for a Vienna game or a King's Gambit, this is definitely the most standard line. And your opponent, 90% of the time at least, is going to play their knight up to c6. And from here you can go ahead with the Spanish or the Ruy Lopez opening with bishop to b5. Now, what this bishop is mainly doing is it's mainly just waiting for your opponent to play d6 and really pinning down this knight. Obviously, there's a threat here of bishop takes c6, and after d takes c6, white can go ahead and snap up that pawn with his knight on e5. So it is obviously gaining an initiative for white. Obviously, black has to react to this move immediately. And there are two main things. There are two main things which you might see from black in this position, and the main one which we're first going to cover is just pawn up to a6. Now, what black is doing in this position is black is putting the question to the bishop. So he's saying, okay man, either you're going to have to retreat your bishop, or you can go ahead and take my knight, and we can exchange so that I don't have to deal with this threat anymore. Because obviously black does not want his knight to be pinned down for so long, as it effectively takes the knight out of the game temporarily. So there are two main things you may cover. I'm going to cover both of them for the two different types of players, which there are. And some people just like to take the knight here on c6. Obviously the bishop's being attacked. This is just called the Ruy Lopez exchange variation. Pretty standard stuff. And because obviously black wants to open up the d file with his queen, you're most likely going to see d takes c6, and then what you can do is then you can go ahead and take this pawn, but it isn't really recommended because then your knight can be attacked, such as bishop d6, and then the knight has to retreat, and it really gives black an advantage. For example, knight takes e5, bishop d6, knight has to go back, and then black can play his knight up to f6. You can see all of a sudden this pawn's under attack. You're going to have to play d3. You can see the black will really have an advantage despite sacrificing the pawn. So that's really not something that we really want to go into, if I'm honest with you. But what you could do in this position is you could play your pawn up to d4, and it does give you some nice central control if you prefer the bishop takes c6 variation. A better move which I like to play if your bishop is being attacked, obviously you are giving up a bishop for a knight in this position, and in what could be a very open game, you don't really want to give up your most powerful minor piece for a knight in this position. So what I recommend doing is just bringing your bishop back to the a4 square in this position. And what this is doing is, it's called the Columbus variation, I believe. And what it's doing is it's bringing the bishop back, still putting pressure on the knight, but just bringing it out of danger. And of course you're confusing your opponent a bit because you can always bring your bishop back to b3 as well. And I can assure you, this is a very, very nice square for the bishop, just eyeing down on f7 all the time. And what you might actually see here is you might see your opponent bring the pawn down to b5, and then the bishop will just drop back to b3. And what this bishop is doing is it's just pointing down at the f7 square, pointing down at where the black king's going to be castling. And it's a very good lever for an attack, especially on this f7 and g8 squares. So, for example, you can always, after this bishop's protecting this square, bring your knight in, bring your queen to f3, really put a lot of pressure on here. So it's a very nice square to have the bishop. And from here, black can make a number of moves. What most people will do in this position is just bring their knight into f6. This is probably what I see at least 90% of the time. And what you might see here is, obviously, black is attacking the undefended pawn on e4. But what you can do, a very nice tactic, which I like to play, and many other people like to play, is just to castle in this position. And you'll notice, firstly, you're leaving the pawn undefended. But secondly, you'll see, if if black goes ahead and takes this pawn, you can then bring your rook over to the open e file in this position. And what you notice is this knight is being attacked, but more importantly, behind this knight is the black king. And the black king obviously has no time to castle because this bishop is still on the f8 square, blocking it from the rook. So what you'll see, say if this player just moves the knight back in this position, then you can play, for example, knight takes e5, and there's actually a very nasty pin in this position. Actually, I think it's called a skewer. So, for example, this rook is lined behind the knight in this position. A very nice tactic. So, for example, if your opponent made a blunder, so maybe he's thinking, okay, I will go and fianchetto this bishop, attacking this king. What you can do is you can play a move like knight takes c6 check, and your opponent might be thinking, oh, well, I can just take back here, but they can't because this king is in check. So I've seen this many a time, and obviously after this check is blocked or whatever, this knight can actually go ahead and win the queen. But obviously at the more higher levels of chess, you're not actually going to see that. If your opponent does take on e4, you can just play rook e1. Another very common thing to see is then your opponent might just play pawn down to d5, and after d3, then obviously this knight's being attacked, and then after the knight goes back, you might even see a trade here, knight takes e5, rook takes e5 check, or probably even more likely, your opponent is not going to play the knight down on e4 at all, because they don't want to get into that stuff. So after castles, you might just see bishop into e7, and after you bring your rook across and castles, knight c3, I think you have a very comfortable game nonetheless, with this open bishop and two knights contributing to the center, and obviously you've got this rook on the e-file which you want to open up with moves like d4. The other thing you might see, which actually leads into a very similar variation, is some of the players just play the knight to f6 immediately, attacking the undefended pawn and getting the initiative. This is called the Berlin defense, and it's actually a Ruy Lopez Mortimer trap. I think it's a Mortimer trap. It might be a fishing pole or something, in which there's a tactic with knight g5, but it's actually a very interesting checkmate for black. I might cover that in another video. I'll put a link right here if I have. But from here again, you can see a similar thing. You just get castled, and if your opponent does go ahead and take, then rook e1. This is the Rio Gambit, so the knight taking on e4. That's what it's called. But then obviously after this knight moves, white definitely has an advantage. So obviously you're probably not going to see knight to f6 from the stronger players. You're more likely just going to see a bishop to e7 preparing to get castled, and then after rook e1, castles, and then you can bring your knight up to c3 and have a very comfortable game. Okay, so that was the main points of the Ruy Lopez for you. I hope you guys will find the video very useful. Please subscribe and check out my other videos, and I've got many other opening tutorials. I've probably got about 6 or 7 now, currently after this one. I will have a lot more probably, but please check them out because I've covered many variations which you guys might find interesting, and how to play against them as well, so I've done ones from the black perspective as well. Okay, so thanks so much for watching everybody. I've been KnifeFighter22. I wish you good luck playing chess, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye everyone.